sit next to you. No, of course.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight to Exile and Bookville's Authors on Tap reading series. This is our second event this year, so I'm a little rusty. Please bear with me. I usually have a script probably on the screen. So thank you all for coming out tonight, virtually and in person. We have a really good crowd. We're going to get started because we're running a little behind, but I just wanted to introduce two amazing people who I've known throughout the years. I've lucky enough to host them various things, and so happy to host them for the first time in my own store. So thank you guys for being here. Thank you, Megan Stielstra. Thank you all thank you so much, Gina, for coming out and celebrating the release of the trade paperback edition of Blow Your House Down. You guys are the book officially comes out next Tuesday, and we get special dispensation from Catapult to celebrate this. You guys are getting early, get the trade paperback early, and you get a nice signature from Gina. We'll also have both books from both authors available after the event. I'm going to get out of the way. Thank you guys so much for once again for being here, and thanks for being such amazing authors and such a great asset to Chicago. So thanks everyone.
Hi everyone. Just real quick, as a way to get started, I do want to acknowledge the history that we're all living in right now. This is the first live event for Gina's book that came out over a year ago. And we're so happy to be in real space with real human beings, and all of you have like bodies in 3D. It's so great and exciting, and you're all really attractive, and I kind of want to touch all of you in ways that might be a little bit inappropriate or maybe really exciting, depending on who you are and what you think of me. Also, hello Zoom, see you as well too, like in the New World Order when we're trying to talk to real human beings, and also you here too. And I also just wanted to say thank you to the bookstore for giving us this amazing space that we get to hang out in, and then we get to go into that amazing space and spend a lot of cash money on the books in there. For 5 or 10 books, because our bookstores need us and we need them, and this is how we save the world. I spend most of my days, maybe many of you do so as well, with the news on in the background, which probably isn't the healthiest thing in the universe, but also again, just wanting to acknowledge there's a million deaths hitting from COVID, and there's a million kids trying to get out of the Ukraine right now. But in thinking and talking about memoir that we're here to do right now, I know there's also a million mountains that all of you have been trying to move in deeply personal ways these past couple of years. I know there are parents in the room in a really impossible school year. There are teachers, there are students. I know there are healthcare workers and activists and organizers. There's some of you who are caring for seniors and caring for small children. And I hope in all of this you've been able to care for yourselves a little bit too. I'm literally seeing heads go like, no. So if that's you, like if you see yourself in that sense, I invite you just to take a minute and breathe. I think Gina and I talk about this a lot, but books for us are kind of a way of breathing, and just to remember that we're going to make it through this, and what it means to take care of our bodies. A writer that we love, Lydia Yakovich, talks all the time about how our bodies can't possibly hold everything the world gives us to hold, but the page can hold it. And there is nobody that I personally have learned that from more than Gina, about what the page can do for us. She was the very first editor to publish one of my stories years ago. She believed in me before I believed in myself. I'm gonna try. She's also my first mentor in this kind of weird and wild ride of trying to be a mother and an artist at the same time. And there have also been several times over the past 20 years when I have called her freaking out, and she showed up on porches or bars to try to tell me how to fix my whole life. When I sat there saying, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do. And Gina would always say, well, what does your body say? And to learn how to trust myself like that is very profound. So I'm so happy to be here with you talking about this book. I know we're just gonna like touch each other. Like, yeah, a whole different kind of video literary experience. But the way that we're gonna roll is we're gonna do a couple of questiony things. I'm gonna ask Gina to read for us. We might do a couple more questiony things, and then I'm gonna open it up for a little Q&A time. And then there will be partying and rain and more wine and solo cups and other exciting exciting such thing. Okay, but just to get this started, hi. She's so
And
pretty.
I almost tackled Javier because I've never seen my paperback. It is not, I've never actually seen it. It's been late on arrival to my house. So I saw you holding it and I was just like, I can take it.
You know, like you just want to pet it. It's so pretty. Okay, so just to start, same question for you that you always ask me whenever we sit in the bars and the porches, just about your body reaction to making this book, because this is a deeply personal one. I mean, you've been writing nonfiction for years, but primarily been novels and short stories in the previous books. And I know that you are a scholar of the body in literature. I know you champion writers who handle the body, but I'm wondering, like, what was going on in your body when you wrote it, when you released it, how it's in the world right now? Yeah.
So, you know, first of all, thank you all for being here in person. And you actually, you know, will hear really different answers than it would have been a year ago, because it's been a ride. And it's been a year of incredible, intense connections with readers. And so, you know, one of the common misperceptions, and many of you in this audience have written memoir in either short or long form. And one of the common misperceptions that you hear from people is that they think that, you know, you just sat down and basically like wrote your diary, you felt catharsis, the sky parted, everything is wonderful now and you're healed. And in reality, of course, when you write a really revealing, difficult, challenging memoir in which you have to kind of not only revisit some of the hardest things that have ever happened to you, but really interrogate your own actions within that context, often you're really re-traumatizing yourself before anything gets better. And so that certainly was the case for me. The writing of the book was intense, tumultuous, powerful, at times all-consuming. I revised the entire book at one point during a 2-week Ragdale stay without my editor, Vance Patenka's permission. I was possessed, but at the same point, I then spent a year and a half waiting for the book to come out, sick, physically sick. I mean, just like feeling like I was on the verge of barfing at all moments of every day, because then you're just like, wait, when I walk to my car, my neighbor may have read this book. Like, you know, like when it's very difficult to put yourself out as the central subject that way when it's not a book about, you know, basically like, here are all the things other people did wrong to me and I'm a great heroine and don't you all feel sorry for me and love me, and etc. So I was scared. And I had a very complex release, because on the one hand, you know, I'd gotten a bunch of starred free pubs, I'd gotten a lot of buzz for the book, like more than had ever happened for any of my novels. Nonfiction memoir is a different beast, you know, in terms of, I guess, marketability and so forth. And so there was a lot of knowledge about the book before it came out. And then I had a really interesting release date, which was the beginning of my little adventures in a love-hate relationship with the New York Times. And that was fun and an adventure and sick-making and exciting. And my publicist kept saying, like, believe me, you're gonna be excited about all this eventually. And she was right. Essentially, I think that through various forms of the book, getting a lot of word of mouth and getting a lot of buzz in the media, for which I was incredibly thankful as an indie author, to whom I'd never had that much attention for a book before. I started to hear from readers almost immediately. And I have heard from readers in the past. This is my 5th book, so obviously, of course, but then I started to hear from more readers and more readers. And within the first couple months of the book being out, I'd heard from hundreds of women. And nothing like that has ever happened in my career. I'm not that kind of writer, generally speaking. And my body changed. My life change from hearing from these women, because all I ever hoped when I was writing this book was, please let me not just be like kind of vomiting on the page for my own catharsis. Please let this be, somehow let me be a lens for other women to think about these issues in the world and what it is to be a middle-aged woman, what it, you know, gender politics, class politics, sexual politics, the medical industrial complex, being a caregiver, all of these different things, being a liar, all of the facts of life and our messy humanity. And I wanted the book to be more than just me and more than just my story, and Counterpoint have really encouraged me to lean in hard to the cultural criticism aspects, which is one of the 8 million reasons I love them. But the fact that then I really began to hear from readers in that way was what made me just take a step back from my body and my story and my fears and all of the roller coaster of it all, and really think like, this is why I ever became a writer. This is, books saved me, like books saved me. And they weren't always the big best-selling books, the famous books, like small books that hardly anyone ever heard of saved me. And to start that dialogue with so many people who I didn't know, but who I had in my head writing this book, was a life transforming dream come true in a way that I no longer have the concerns that I had going.
Okay, all right. It's that kind of that feeling of no feeling is final, right? Like the fears that we have at one place change and they move because we get to change. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about memoir. You came to talk to, I work with a bunch of really brilliant memoirists at Catapult. You came to talk to us. One of the things that you said to our room, like I'm still carrying around all the time, was about how memoir needs to have both. And I think just you starting to talk about your own experience with that, that's getting into the self-analysis. But I'm wondering if you can talk to this room about that idea a little bit, just because I don't think I'd ever heard it articulated in that way.
So I know almost everyone in this room, so you all know that I've been an editor for over 25 years at 9 million different publications and so forth. And it always was true to me, particularly in creative nonfiction, that the things that took my attention as an editor, the difference between like, wow, this person has had a really interesting life and they can write about it with amazing sentences, versus I will die if I don't get to publish this piece and I must have this piece, always tended to be what I was kind of mentioning just a moment ago in terms of there being that lens to the wider world, and the author, the narrator, having a sense of speaking to wider issues through the self, and not through like self-aggrandizement of being like, I am every woman, because Janet Burway, who is a craft writer primarily for fiction, and whose craft book I teach a lot, talks a lot about the only way to get to the universal is to go deeply into the individual. That if you start out with this sort of like, I'm going to write a novel about the dissolution of the American dream, like, no, you're not. Like, who is your novel about? And what keeps them up at night when they wake up at 4 a.m? Why are they sweating? Like, what is the memory of their past that keeps bearing on their decisions right now? Like, what would they pick out at this clothing store that you just walked into? What music do they listen to on their headphones? Like, you have to start from that small, like incredibly individually personal place. And I believe for both novel and memoir, that also entails having a character who has agency, right? Who makes choices. And that, as Burway also says, only trouble is interesting in fiction. Well, if only trouble is interesting in fiction, imagine what is interesting when you're a not famous person writing a memoir about your life. Like, why would anyone want to read about, like, you know, I'm a perfect person, I've had a perfect life, the end, you know? So of course, when memoirs go to the page, we are usually visiting our dark places. And for me, the big link there as a longtime fiction writer was that I had to be able to treat myself as ruthlessly as I would one of my own female protagonists. And I've been writing messy, difficult, sexy, smart, sometimes really fucked up female protagonists my entire literary career. They are the only, not only women, but protagonists who make mistakes are the only kind that interest me. I'm often interested, I used to be a therapist, I'm often interested in hearing about the wrongs that have been done to people or bad luck that's happened to people through no fault of their own. But on the page, I feel like to grapple with human psychology and to grapple with a larger picture, we have to be looking at people with some amount of agency. And so when I started to be able to look at myself as that basically now I was that protagonist, I had to be able to treat myself as ruthlessly as I would one of my characters in a novel. I had to not, you know, obviously I had my own motivations and many times made excuses for myself, but I also had to look deeper at that and not just take that as a given, and that my worldview in a given static moment was the only way to see a situation. And so as I started to really pull myself apart as a character, I feel like that allows me to see the bigger picture, because it stops being a focus on just this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me, and it starts to be a picture of why do we make the choices we do? What are the factors that play in to very common societal choices and, you know, mistakes, epiphanies, rapture, you know, infatuation, intoxication, grief, all of these things. And we start to tell a more collective story by not protecting ourselves and by actually going to those deep places in ourselves. And that's the kind of work I love as an editor. And every place I've ever edited for creative nonfiction, I've had really tight time, like space, you know, constraints. And the most common reason that I turn work away is, like, you know, when I'm talking about work that I would love to publish because it's really good, is this is about one person in a moment where something really interesting happens and the writer can really write lyrical, beautiful prose. This is a window to the world. And those two things, I think they have to exist together in the same text. Like, I don't think you can be a window to the world. Maybe if you're writing journalism about a topic, of course, but like, I don't think you can be a window to a wider situation if you're not willing to look ruthlessly at why you made certain choices and why you are the way you are and what you were a product of, because none of us are that unique. And by going into our specifics, we find collective specifics.
I want to give folks an example here in the text of what you're talking about, right? And also selfishly, I just want to hear you read again, because it's been a minute. And sidebar, the very first time I heard Gina read, she was 8 months pregnant. She was wearing a skin tight dress and like 6-inch heels, and she was reading this super steamy hot sex scene. Like, all of us in the crowd were melting. Like, it's like we were in a Def Leppard video. It was amazing. Were you reading this from the first essay? Okay, just because again, I think it's an example of it, like the self-analysis, the societal indictment, but also if you haven't dug into the book yet, then lucky you, because you get to read it for the first time. But it does move as a memoir in essays, so each section of it is deeply unique. Gina's dealing with all sorts of different forms, all sorts of different points of view shifts. And I'm really interested in the first one specifically. So I want you to.
So I'll say,
Yeah.
to start with, that the first chapter is the last thing I wrote. I wrote it at Ragdale when I completely, without permission, revised my entire book. And the reason that I wrote it was essentially that the book otherwise began with a chapter called Death's Monkey Spear, which was about taking my youngest child to my old neighborhood and about my father's health problems, mental and physical, and about my role in the family as a caregiver and all of these things. And it was an essay that had been published and that had actually been anthologized a couple of times. And I liked the essay and I really revised it and worked hard on it. But I didn't feel that it fairly represented the book because it was a pretty traditional personal essay, very straight narrative. And my book's weird. So like one chapter is a dictionary, but that's also a direct address to my now husband. One chapter has 50 sections that travel a vast amount of time, basically dealing with women in chronic pain and the medical industrial complex. So there are a lot of, there's a flash piece that's quite racy. I mean, there's a lot of different types of writing in here. So finally I got to the place where I revised everything and I still was beginning with Death's Monkey Spear and I was like, something's wrong. And then I just kind of want to shout out to my husband who went the path of traumatic memoir writing prior to myself and was sick for 2 years to lead up to his book, just like I was. And so I had learned quite a bit from him in his process. And one of the things that he had said so often was the notes are the book. And I was like, why am I not happy with the beginning? Why am I not happy with the beginning? Like, what is this beginning supposed to be? And I just opened one of my early notebooks and I have been taking all these notes about the role of the adulteress in history, in literature, in psychology, in law, all of these different things. And I had all these stats and I had all these notes and I had done all this research and I had, and I had included none of that in the book. And so instead I started a different opening chapter, and it's called The Story of A. It begins, the lie which elates us is dearer than 1,000 sober truths. And that's Anton Chekhov misquoting Pushkin. A is for adulteress, but you knew that. There's virtually no history of literature without the adulteress. Anna Karenina, Emma Bovary, Hester Prynne, Daisy Buchanan, Molly Bloom. The adulteress throws herself in front of a train, runs over her husband's lover with a car, walks into the ocean intent on dying without a care for her children. A is for adulteress, agent of ruin, woman. A is for accused. Researchers at Cardiff Metropolitan University revealed that when there's been infidelity in a marriage, most wives tend to blame the other woman, whereas most husbands see their cheating wife as the guilty party. Basically, whoever dropped dead in the broom closet, the adulteress did it. A is for author. Allow me to reveal the A on my breast. For the sake of this narrative, my name might as well be A. Once a woman becomes an adulteress, her other identities, mother, daughter, friend, editor, writer, teacher, become largely invisible to others, as irrelevant as the clothing she whorishly, treasonously shed. A is for asshole. There is no slur for men to match the equivalent of mistress or even other woman. Philanderer doesn't have the same punch and is sex non-specific. Cuckold denotes a man who's being cheated on. A player or even a dog could be single or married. An asshole could be the guy who took your parking space at Trader Joe's, as well as the man who fucked your wife. There are no names specifically for men who break their promises to women. A is for age. For the first time in documented human history, among adults 18 to 29 who have ever been married, a general social survey reports that women are marginally more likely than men to be unfaithful. The survey also found that infidelity rates increase in middle age for both men and women, and that contrary to social and literary stereotypes, women reach their highest levels of infidelity in their 60s. A is for analysis. While wives initiate almost 70% of divorces, the researcher Michael Rosenfeld recently made the surprising discovery that no similar gap between sexes, or any gap at all, exists between the percentage of breakups initiated by women and men living together without marriage. Rosenfeld also found that although married women have long reported lower levels of satisfaction with relationship quality than married men, those in non-marital relationships report equal levels of quality. These results, Rosenfeld said, quote, support the feminist assertion that some women experience heterosexual marriage as oppressive or uncomfortable. A is for adultery. In the United States, adultery remains illegal across 17 states. In Illinois, where A first kissed her lover, the wrong spouse can even sue the cheater's lover for alienation of affection. In Massachusetts, where A and her lover reinstigated their affair 2.0 after having been broken up for nearly 9 months, adultery is a felony, theoretically punishable by up to life in prison. And this will be the last section I read, so I won't go too long, but I have A is for old, A is for hag, A is for crone, those are all crossed out. A is for ancient. Various recent studies using extensive data from online dating sites have revealed that women's perceived attractiveness by men hits its highest point at the age of 18 and declines steadily thereafter, Elizabeth Burge, and that the peak age of women's attractiveness is somewhere around 22 or 23, Christian Rudder. According to Rudder, co-founder of OkCupid, quote, younger is better and youngest is best of all. For men, by contrast, attractiveness seems to increase steadily with age, peaking somewhere between 46 and 50. Given these facts, one might wonder what irrational force could possibly have prompted A to believe that she still matters enough for all this fuss to begin with, for all this inconveniencing of other upstanding people who had expectations of and plans involving her. Just look at the way she's carrying on, as though she honestly doesn't realize she's statistically unfuckable anyway. A is for the audacity of her.
Thinking of the setup that you gave us for this and how you sat there like knowing that you were unhappy with it. And there have been so many times working with you editorially where you have said to me, what is your body, like, what does your body say about the work? And I was like, that it's not working. And you were like, well, great, go fix it and then bring it back to me. Right, but just that feeling, not only with my life, but also with the work. So I love hearing it. You had to have that same conversation with yourself.
Of course.
One of the next A sections goes into A is for anger. And Gina starts kind of building out what anger means in the, specifically women's anger in our current cultural climate. And then partway through that section, you just have the line, who am I to judge anyone? And I want to bring up just the idea of judgment into these pages, because it, like back to this idea of societal indictment, many of these sections are written addressed to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury. You are preparing yourself for the judgment. There's also a whole section that's told in like the legal language of a court case and strategy and the legal language. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like consciously entering those pages with the idea of not warding off judgment, but addressing it?
Yeah, it was almost the opposite. So I mean, obviously, of course, like Humbert addresses ladies and gentlemen, like of the jury in Lolita, and so obviously not to equate myself with one of, you know, the most famous pedophile in literature, but my whole point there is that, of course, like, you know, he convinces no one, right? And so to me, those sections were intentionally about the way that we rationalize our behavior and spin our wheels and tell ourselves stories and how those stories shift over time. And but also they break a wall and acknowledge the reader, right? And that the reader brings their own history. So we all are reading the same words, but everyone reads a different book. And so, you know, so if you've had breast cancer, you may read my book a particular way because we've both had breast cancer. But also, if you've been cheated on in a long-term marriage and you're reading a book by somebody who had an on and off 3.5-year affair, you also bring your history of pain that was inflicted upon you to this book. And so to me, those sections were opportunities to delve into a former mindset of kind of like stories I spun for myself, rationalizations I made for myself, but they also were a chance to sort of acknowledge, like, you know, you don't want to hear the true love defense. Like that's, you know, the fact of we all judge others and are judged. And, you know, it may not be our most attractive human quality, but I myself, of course, am guilty of it too. And one of the things I struggle with an enormous amount on the page, and of course, you know, the actions of this book, I mean, well, they span my entire life, but the primary actions of this book span between around 2012 to 2018. So I'm a bit distanced even from the later parts now. And, you know, I don't carry around as much self-castigation as I did at one point, because I've always believed, but it was hard to put into action, that we don't serve others very much by being kind of narcissistically obsessed with our own guilt, and just always wringing our hands about like being the piece of shit at the center of the universe. And this has been a belief system of mine for a long time. I believe that like empathy and magnanimity often come from a place of not being self-obsessed, and guilt is a form of self-obsession. And so I have made a lot of strides from the time of writing this book, but at the time I was first writing it, I had a running narrative in my head every single day about why I was the piece of shit at the center of the universe, you know, and the book was a way for me to kind of crack some of that open and look not only at things I was ashamed of that I've actually made choices about, but actually start to examine the concept of shame in general and judgment in general. And some of the things that I realized I carried a lot of shame around had to do with sexual desire, had to do with still having an inner life and not being static, despite the fact that my role was supposed to be mother and caregiver of my parents, mother of 3 children, you know, that I wasn't staying in my box. I was supposed to stay in my box, you know, and I wanted too much, I demanded too much, I had unrealistic expectations, etc. All of these things that I struggled with. And so I just kept going deeper into the idea of like, what are we ashamed of? Like, we are not only ashamed of acts that we did that hurt people, but sometimes we're ashamed that we're sick. We're ashamed that we have a disability. We're ashamed that we have a body. We're ashamed that we want any particular type of sex that is perfectly fine to want, but that maybe we weren't taught that. And so to me, that whole thread of like, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, was like, calling myself on my own bullshit, you know, with like a fun literary nod, which I'm a bit obsessed with, but also, you know, the idea that like, you are part of the book, and what are the stories you may be telling yourself about your shame and your body and your desires and your mistakes. And one of the exercises I give my students constantly is to write a prompt is to write about the mistake you thank yourself for making. And I guess I'll finish there.
Yeah. I love what you just said about all of us being involved in the book, because pretty much every single section where you're addressing us, the reader, as the jury, it's not you coming in self-defense, right? It's not Gina coming in like, this is why I did this, don't judge me. But you always pose it as questions that you're, I actually have this paragraph, I printed it out and it's thumbtacked to my wall. And I read it every day, and I'm gonna offer it to all of you, because maybe some of you also need it in your lives. This is an example of what we're talking about. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, maybe you, now or at some time of your life, have struggled not to hate yourself too, have had to trust for a time the love in someone else's eyes before you could find the strength to claw your way back from the ledge on your own steam. Or am I wrong in believing that if we are fully alive, if we are still growing and changing, it is hard, so unfathomably hard, to reach the age of 50 with hands that are clean? Something else I want to say really quick, just about how you involve the audience. There's how you involve it in the text. But I kind of forgotten about this until you were just talking about how people view a text at different stages in their own life, right? Like how we bring ourselves to the page. And when Gina first sent me the galley of this book, I don't know if you remember this, but my husband had just left, had just split. And so I was very much in a place of and Gina wrote this, you wrote me a long letter, my love, just about how you didn't know if now was the time for me to enter this text. Like it was basically like, it was essentially a content warning from your best girlfriend, right? Like, to know the story, right? But just that kind of care that you give us in the text, but also the individual people in your life, I find very profound. And that kind of leads me, I literally have a list here of 900 questions that I want to ask you, but I want to do one more, and then I do want to open it up to the group. But again, it comes back to this connection. I've read an infinite number of reviews of this book. I'm going to wager many of us have as well. They are all deeply charged, which I love. Nobody is lukewarm about this text. And they talk about all the various things, right? Like they talk about the adultery, they talk about the marriage, they talk about the kid, they ask questions about all of these things. And I would like to offer you all my mini review right now, which is, this is also a book about female friendship in a way that I haven't seen discussed yet, because so much of what happens in here starts and begins with the death of your best friend, Kathy, and you asking questions about how she would have viewed you and what it meant for you to go through this without her support. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that aspect of it.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. And of course, if you've lost a friend or parent or anything, you know how just absolutely surreal it is that you keep going and they stay where they were. And then you get to a point where if your life has been anything like mine in the last decade, they might not recognize you anymore. And that is powerful in its own way. But for me, so losing my friend Kathy, who was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and was dead within 4 months, at the age of 43, was a very formative experience. At a time of life in which I thought I had pretty much finished having formative experiences because I didn't know anything. And
because so much of our literature tells us
that's
that
right.
We're done, like you're
That's
40
right.
and you're done.
Look, I've been in the same relationship for 21 years. I have 3 children. I lived in a house with my 2 parents and my family. I had the same best friends I've had since I was in elementary and high school. I was back in Chicago after many years away. I mean, I thought that the full circle business was done. I thought that this was it. This was my life. And at times I thought that euphorically, and other times I thought that I don't know. I don't know how I will continue to be in this container of my skin if this is true, and that varied at different times. But when my friend Kathy died, I had depended on her for an extraordinary amount. And why that was interesting to me was that the perception we gave to the world, to even our closest friends, was that she depended upon me for everything, right? So she was single, she didn't have her own children, she didn't have a lot of money. She had a more turbulent, her father had died by suicide, she had a lot of trauma in her life. And she sort of she took my mother's old job when my mother retired. She was my kid's first nanny. She was a reader for my magazine and press. She was often with me and my ex-husband as our third person at every gathering. She went with me to doctor's appointments. She was just always around. She was always available. And so a lot of people would say things to me like, isn't she a little clingy, or don't you feel like this, that, or the other? She's too dependent on you. And honestly, you know, sometimes like friendship is complicated. So I loved her madly, but sometimes the answer was, actually, I do feel that way. Yeah, thank you. Yes, I feel that way. And then she was dead. And at that point, I realized how much I had depended on her to basically be that person who was always unconditionally accepting, interested, wanting my company, of, you know, available, like, just, she had filled so many spaces in my life. And I had been fairly unaware of that because she was perpetually available and there to fill those spaces. And then when she was gone, I was not only grieving her death, which of course, like, we'd known each other since we were 16, we were like sisters. So obviously, of course, that in and of itself was incredibly sick making, and you know, I was not in a normal state of mind, but on top of which, the loneliness was stunning. You know, I was this person who from the outside, and I had believed my own hype. Like, from the outside, I looked like the least lonely person you could possibly be. I lived in a house with 3 children, a longtime spouse, my 2 parents with whom I was very close, despite the fact that they were super eccentric and like bizarre, but we were really, really close, and they were wonderful people. And I had friends from high school, from grade school, from college, from graduate school. Many of my friends had married each other because I had introduced them. Like, and so you would look at my life and be like, wow, you know, look at all those great relationships. And it was true, but it was also true that Kathy had been kind of a surrogate spouse to me emotionally for many years. She was the person who I always actually felt like wanted to hear what I had to say, or you know, wasn't annoyed if I called her at work, you know. And when she was gone, I didn't have anywhere to put that. I put it in my kids, I put it in my parents, but I didn't have anywhere really to put that companionship. And it made me reckless, and it made me thrashing, and it made me hungry. And there was someone I'd been emotionally in love with for some time, and I don't really know, because we can't live 2 lives. I quote this in Kundera, like, you know, we can't see what our other life would have been like. Like, I don't really know whether my now husband and love of my life, like, whether we would ever have had an affair if Kathy hadn't died. We might have been quietly long distance in love for some time until that became impractical and never consummated, and gone about our respective very lonely lives. And so she was a catalyst to me. The recklessness was, you know, the recklessness of grief is considerable. And it made me behave in ways that were uncharacteristic. And now from a great distance, I can also see that we're incredibly liberating and wildly necessary.
You sent me a text the other day that said that life is too short to not give yourself to a ferocious love. And I'm going to carry that around with me, but I'm grateful to Kathy for throwing that your way as well. Y'all, what do you want to ask of this brilliant brain? Gretchen.
So the body of writing, I just want to like track back to that for a second. Because you mentioned Lydia, and you mentioned when your book and Brittany Hogan's book came out, you were sick for 2 years before. So I just dipped my toe into a tiny bit of vulnerability and published an essay yesterday about basically being mentally ill for half the year of seasonal depression. It's like very serious for me. And I posted it, and then I felt sick all day yesterday. I felt like I might have MS, like my whole body was just like tingling. And I went to my acupuncturist this morning, and she said, without me mentioning anything, she just said, "What's going on with you?" And she's assessing like my tongue and just my person and my pulse. And she made me, I wasn't connected to the fact that bothered me, and she made me keep talking until I confessed that I published this essay, and my grade school friends and my high school boyfriend had like told me they read it. But it was the vulnerability of putting that out there that was clearly like making me very sick. I'm fine after the treatment, actually. So what I want to know is how did you and your husband and anybody else who has had that sort of bodily reaction to making yourself so vulnerable, how did you come out of that state? Like, what was that like?
So literally, I have, the great thing about creative nonfiction is that because the plot is already dictated, if it's too metaphorical or symbolic, like no one can be like, oh, well, you just put this neat metaphor in there. But so I'm going to give you a wild metaphor. So in the few months leading up to the publication of this book, I became afflicted with entire body hives. They were so severe and covering so much of my body, crusted in blood and scabs, like that I ended up in the ER. They had basically infiltrated my system to such a point that like my heart rate was like 160. I had a fever, and no one could, they're called idiopathic hives. No one could figure out what they were about. I also got diagnosed with asthma during that period of time, which I, and that was interesting. But basically, like, my anxiety was on my skin, and there may have been other reasons. We had a really sick cat who was running around, doing things that should not be done, like everywhere in the house. And, so, I mean, obviously there are other reasons you could be having an allergic reaction and so forth, but it went on for like 3 months. And this is how conversations change with time. So I went to a great acupuncturist and herbalist, and he really helped me. And then I also went to California. We were doing a renovation on our desert house out there, and I went out to California, and I was in a different environment and maybe with less toxic cat business going on. And and I began to feel a little bit better, but not enough better that I still wasn't taking these herbs twice a day and going once a week whenever I was in Chicago for acupuncture, and it was still really afflicting me. And then the book got published, and at first that did me no favors, but I'm just going to basically go back around to then I started to hear from other women, and I started to hear from them about a lot of things, so whether it was, I accepted a meal train today because you said in your book you didn't take one, or, you talk in your book about how you resolved to believe that you deserve to live after your cancer diagnosis. And, and the letter writer, as a mother, knowing that death by suicide was not an option to her, but that it had never occurred to her that she deserved to live. So these were not all, I mean, some of them were also I gave your book to my mother in Nairobi because she had an affair 30 years ago, and she's been torturing herself ever since. And I believe this book will set her free, so I mean, but they spanned a wide array of topics. And to get, just to say it simply, I mean, I'm an indie press person to my core, and I believe that if I would rather have a profound connection with one reader than an entertainment connection with millions of readers. And I've lived by that as an editor, as a writer, my entire life, the ways I choose to write. I do not choose to write in particularly commercially marketable ways. But to hear from eventually, like I said, hundreds of women across a variety of platforms about their bodies, about their truths, about their shame, about the way that hearing someone say unspeakable things set them free in some way, I stopped being sick. And I think, I think ultimately we write the book we needed during our time of greatest distress. We write the book we wanted to read. And I had scoured everywhere for a book that would look honestly at some of this stuff, like when I was living it. I wrote poems. I'm a bad poet. I wrote poems about like the lack of a template for where I was out on this ledge. And I wrote a book with my biggest hope being that one woman out there would be looking desperately for a book that would say things she didn't think she was allowed to say. And I just think that community heals.
Y'all, if a book has done something like this for you, can you take 5 minutes and tell the writer? Like, can that be a thing that like you bounce home and do later? Like Gina and I have no power to give you assignments, but maybe like just even thinking about how the work can help, and then if you let the maker know that, then more work might get made, and then this is how we save the world.
Hi, I just wondering about when we say things that people didn't think we should be allowed to be said. One of the challenging parts of writing a memoir is being both truthful and as gutsy as you are as a writer, but also like how the people in your life get affected by what you write.
Sure.
So the things that I most want to write, I keep to myself often because of that fear. So I'm just wondering, do you have experiences where people were, upset by what you wrote? Did you
So
change things or allow
the
things? How did you work with some of that?
So one of the things that I talk a lot about when I teach is the lens. Where is your lens, right? And so I think that we are all very entitled to our stories as long as they are our stories. And we do not presume, and this is not new to me as a writer of literary fiction, where ambiguity and multiple interpretations and so forth, I mean, that's what I love. That's what makes me tick. And so for me, I try to stay very much in my own lane. I try to write my perceptions with a complete awareness that these are obviously not the perceptions of everyone else involved. Now, when it came to my kids, I was sending my daughters bits of the book for quite some time, being like, please veto anything you don't want me to say, like blah, 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 blah. And, and they were sort of like steadfastly ignoring that request. And finally, I said, like, you understand we're going to go to copy edits. Like, you haven't told me to change anything. Like, I'm terrified that in 2 years, you're going to say, like, why did you write X? Like, I want you to change anything you don't want me to say. And they were like, we're not going to tell you to change. Like, you're a writer, write what you want. Like, it's your story. And I did the same with my husband, who's in the back there. Like, I said, like, is there anything here that's not okay? Is there anything here that I should change? And, he's a writer too, and he was like, it would be abhorrent to me to say to another writer, like, take this out, you know. I can't say that everything you wrote was easy for me to read, but I absolutely like would never ask you to change anything. So, you know, I think that I was given gifts by some of the people very close to me in my life, but I was also very careful. I mean, I obtained a couple of legal reads. I did that of my own volition on my own dime, because I wanted to make sure that I was actually in my lane and ethical. And, you know, it was an educational experience for me. It helps me as a teacher to talk to other writers about their books. So, you know, I think that sometimes it's very legitimate if there is a relationship that is so important to you that you feel would be destroyed by writing your story. It's a very personal choice. Sometimes it is not worth it, you know, but not being worth it isn't the same as you not having the right to do it.
I think volcano just erupted on top of my head. Could somebody write that line down for me? Gretchen, do you have your pen? Can you write that down? I do have one eye on the clock. We can get one or two more? Hi.
No, some of what you said actually reminded me of my grandmother. She's she was born in 1930 and is still alive, and her husband passed away over 20 years ago, probably closer to 30. And just some of what you said reminded me very much of her, because, you know, she's outliving most of her friends, and she already outlived her husband, and I think he was maybe her boyfriend, and he committed suicide and was having a lot of medical issues, and yeah.
I mean, it's, you know.
And, you know, she's still doing hospice and stuff, even into her 90s, and still has her own house, and she and her sisters are still sharp enough to fuck around and mess around with scammers.
You know, I mean, my mom was born in the early 1930s and she died in 2019. But, you know, one of the things that doesn't get talked about as much, look, when you write a book in which adultery is featured, every review and interview is going to mention that always, like there will not be one where it doesn't come up, but there will be entire reviews or interviews in which, like, having cancer or having your friend die or having both of your parents die while you're, you know, about to get cancer, going through contentious divorce and you're parenting and, you know, all of these things, those things didn't get as much press, but I definitely consider the book a grief memoir as much as it is absolutely anything else. I mean, you know, over the course of the book, I lose my best friend. I lose my breasts. I lose my father. I lose my mother. Through the complex actions involving both parties, lose all relationship with the person I had been with for 25 years. You know, there's a lot of loss in the book. And I think that is a place we all get to at some point in our lives. Like, if we're lucky enough to be the people still standing grieving instead of being the ones who others are grieving because we went too young. So yeah, I mean, I think I hear you, and my father had a very similar experience, being kind of like the last man standing from his former life.
In thinking about how, and Kathy, I'm coming to you next, like you just described the book as a brief memoir, and here are all these moments of loss. the same time, I'm thinking about just the singular line, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, fuck, there was love. And so that's all through this book as well, too.
There's a line from Ian McEwan's Atonement that it says, you know, there was the crime, but there were also the lovers.
Mhm.
And the quote is given twice in the course of the book, and I stand by what I said to you in my text. I mean, like, there are situations where there is no right answer. If you are wildly, passionately in love, is it a moral act to negate that and kick it to the curb because it's not what you were supposed to do? It's a different kind of immoral act than to have an affair, but like, there isn't a choice in these situations that is clean and that doesn't devastate a number of people. And, you know, I think human connection is our reason for being alive, right? I mean, it's like, the world is a hard place and living in a body is a hard thing. And our human relationships are what get us through. And when you meet somebody or you have someone in your life who you don't feel like you can live without, you know, in an authentic way, you can absolutely make the choice to do what you're supposed to do and go on. But parts of you will die, and parts of you will die no matter what you do.
It's like you're just talking to me on the porch and there are all these people just watching us.
So I'm advising a graduate student who's writing a intense and profound, amazing autofiction that is a rape narrative. And the character in this is not doing anything that is in the box of what's acceptable for a rape narrative. And reading this, I said, this is amazing, powerful writing. It's for sure going to get published. It's great, but I hope that the student is prepared for the blowback of not fitting into the box. And I had the exact same feeling when I read the advanced reading copy of your book. I said, I hope that Gina's prepared for the blowback of not fitting into the box of what an adultery story is supposed to be. I know that you have the thick skin to do that, but do you have any advice that I could tell my student to prepare for it?
Honestly, so, I mean, I have to say, like, of course, when an entire full page of the biggest forum of the, you know, on the planet is devoted to saying, like, she's the worst. That qualifies as blowback. But I can very, very clearly state that I expected wildly more blowback than I received. In the end, that was the only unilaterally negative review that the book received in a review venue. And, you know, I didn't expect that. I mean, I actually thought that people were going to kind of universally judge and despise me. And I was willing to put the book out anyway, because I was like, that's exactly why I have to put the book out, because there are all these other people, not just women, you know, women, but people of all genders who have done things for which they feel they would be universally despised, and yet they're still human beings. They're not sociopaths or war criminals, or, you know, I mean, they're people who did things that did damage, and they have to find a way to go on in their lives and not stay so stuck in that moment of self-loathing or fear of judgment that they cannot lead a positive or constructive life. And so I actually think it's interesting. There is more of a zeitgeist going on right now that made my book actually received quite differently in the critical community than I had expected. Like when we got, the first pre-pub star, I was like, I've never gotten that before. And then another one came, and then, and I was just like, what's happening? Why don't they hate me? And, so I definitely would say you have to go in with with an awareness for sure, and like when the New York Times contacted Counterpoint, it was like, we're going to run a chapter of this book, and Counterpoint was like, that's our first request of this. This is awesome. Like, oh my God, it must be a rave. And my friend Todd Goldberg, who knows everything, said, or editors don't quite agree with the extent to which you are about to be crucified. And I was like, that's a take, so and they ended up giving me an editor's choice. It was quite an adventure. So, I would say, like, you don't know, like, we are usually our own worst enemies. And there was nothing anyone could have said about this book that I didn't tell myself at some point, but in the end, the reception was much more positive than I had ever for 5 seconds entertained the possibility of it being. And I think that there are a lot of people out there who are tired of the idea that women's memoir ends always with like the happy marriage, the child, the I'm now redeemed. I know all the things about how you should lead a good and happy life. Now I'm a sage, etc. Like this
What I
interest.
love about your book is the fact that how much you're turning those kind of stereotypes.
Right. I mean, it's like, there's this massive push in the publishing industry to intersect self-help and women's literary memoir. And if that's what you are seeking to do, by all means, like, great, but that is not what I was seeking to do. I was seeking to tell a complicated story in which I was absolutely not anybody's guru. And, and I hope some readers will be receptive to that, and a lot more than I expected were receptive.
I want to bring this back around to the beginning, and then I want to let us move over for the wine portion of the show, just because I do have my eyes on the clock, and I know people have to get rolling. But just, I think, in addition to the question about preparing for blowback, I want to throw you back to the first thing that Gina talked about, which was the hundreds of women showing up in her inbox. And yes, there are going to be people who our work is not for, and yes, there are going to be people who want to arm wrestle us but whatever. The blowback is going to be there. And also, fuck the law, right? And the people showing up in our inboxes who deeply need it. So that might be a thing to remind this writer of as well too, is the work and the story is needed.
You're not going to know until you start interacting with your readers. And if that's not what we're here for, I don't know what we're here for.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Edna.
Thank you all for showing up today. This is fantastic. We're going to go on for another hour or so, but I know everyone wants to get up and move around and have a few drinks, shop a little bit if you'd like. Books are on sale. Inside the bookstore, we have like 3 of your books and 3 of Gina's books, so please shop. Holidays are right around the corner. There'll be a signing table right over there. You guys, 2 chairs.
For a moment, I was like, what month are we in? What's happening?
It's never too early to know. You never know, it's never too early. So everyone, stick around, have a good time, and thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. Gina, Megan, thank you so much.